The verdict reached the clerk's alcove before it reached the bench, and that was how Rilnovet knew it was a lie. It came folded in quarters, a broker's wire sheet still warm from the copying drum, passed hand to hand through the recess huddle outside the Hall of Findings the way contraband. Sweets had passed through her hatching school. Tesselspire's 6 bell had not yet rung. The session was in recess. The bench had not spoken. And yet here was the ruling of the adjudicature of wrecks and findings in the matter of the carrier gilt promise, printed in trade gray ink, circulating among commodity brokers 2 full hours before any assessor was due to read it aloud. Riln held the sheet by its corner, the way her people held anything that might stain. Around her the huddle churned, junior advocates, lane runners, a Velith carriage house factor already smiling with all 4 of his mouth plates. The corridor smelled of recessed tea and machine oil and the cold mineral breath of Yend, the gas giant that filled every western window of the spire like a wall of bruised amber. She read it once, fast, the way clerks read. Finding for the Velith carriage house. The biological cargo recovered from the carrier gilt promise. 41 units laden, 34 units surviving. Adjudged escaped registered stock under the open lane retrieval permits, to be returned to the permit holder. Hull value split between the patrol cutter stave of Yend and the Orsano Mutual Indemnity House. Transfer of the surviving units to the carrier Pelham Rose to be executed upon entry of the verdict into the standing record. 34 units. Riln had spent 11 days in the same hall as those units. She had transcribed the sound one have made when the smallest of them, a boy, the humans called that age a boy, coughed in the holding gallery, the way every adult head among them turned at once. The way a woman with a navigator's burn scar on her wrist moved between the boy and the bailiffs, without seeming to move at all. The standing record did not have a column for that. Riln had invented one in the margin of her own mind and filed it where her oaths could not reach it. She read the sheet a second time, slow, the way Sarwin read, and there it was. Third paragraph of the reasoning. The verdict cited its decisive proof as Exhibit 44K, the recovery manifest of the gilt promise, and quoted it. The units were recovered, restrained, and hold to, consistent with stock and carriage. Riln's second heart stumbled against the first. There was no Exhibit 44K. There had not been an Exhibit 44K for 19 days. She knew, because she was the one who had killed it. On the 9th day of filings, when 3 claimants' private numbering systems had tangled the docket into a snarl, Chief Clerk Marr had given the consolidation to the most junior quill in the pool, to her, and Riln had spent a sleepless double-shift folding 306 exhibits into one clean ledger. Velith's K-series had died that night. Their 44K had been reborn as Exhibit 19, and every party had been served the conversion table, and every citation spoken in that hall since had used the new numbers, because she had checked, because checking was the whole of her function and most of her religion. A verdict written from the certified record would say Exhibit 19. A verdict written from Velith's private brief, written before the record closed, written by someone working from the claimant's own files, written, perhaps, before half the testimony had ever been heard, would say 444K. And the quote was wrong too. Recovered, restrained, and hold to. She had transcribed every hour of the boarding testimony herself, her quill arm aching, her membranes dry from not blinking. Wing Captain Ezet Vorn of the Stave of Yend had said, under oath in words now sealed into the certified transcript, "We found them on the bridge. The humans had not been found in any hold. They had been found flying the ship." Restrained and hold to existed in exactly one document Riln had ever handled, a deposition sworn out in advance by the surviving mate of the gilt promise, a Holland, the younger brother of the dead shipmaster. That deposition had been withdrawn on the 6th day, pulled back by Velith's own advocate before it could be tested, after the mate sat down in the witness ring, looked at the humans across the hall, and refused to swear to it. Withdrawn matter was dead matter. It was not in the record. Quoting it in a verdict was like serving a meal from a grave. The sheet shook very slightly. Riln made it stop. Around her, the huddle had begun to price the ruling. A grain factor was already composing a wire to the Pelham exchange. Someone laughed, actually laughed, and said the Velith house had gotten its livestock back, and the lanes had gotten their precedent, and wasn't it tidy? And would there be tea before the 6th bell or after? The precedent. That was the word that made Riln fold the sheet and put it inside her sleeve against her skin, where her oaths lived. Because the case of the gilt promise had never really been about one carrier and one cargo, and every clerk in the spire knew it, even if no assessor had said it aloud. 3 claimants had come to the adjudicature to argue about who owned a drifting ship and the things found alive inside it. 11 days of testimony had quietly turned the question into something else. Something the findings code had no column for. Whether the things found alive inside it could be owned at all. The brokers understood. That was why the wire sheet existed. Somebody with money on the answer had wanted the markets to know the answer before the bench stood up. And somebody on the bench, or close enough to the bench to where it's ink, had sold it to them, sold it. And in selling it, shown her the seam. If the verdict had leaked clean, real numbers right quotes, it would have been unstoppable, a corruption with no edges to grip. But whoever wrote it had worked from the claimant's brief and the claimant's dead deposition, and had never imagined that anyone would check a citation against the Consolidated Index. Because nobody read the Consolidated Index. Because the Consolidated Index was the work of the most junior clerk in the pool and existed for no one. It existed for her. The sixth bell began its warning toll, 3 soft strokes meaning 1 hour. In 1 hour the bench would enter, and Prime Assessor Anuvel would unseal a verdict Riln now believed had been written by a hand it should never have touched, and read into the standing record a quote from a document that did not exist. And 34 living beings would be walked up the ramp of the Pelham Rose, whose holds she had seen the harbor manifest cross her desk that morning, stamped in routine, had already been fitted with carriage racks sized for a human frame. Riln Ovid was the 4th transcript clerk of the Adjudicature of Wrecks and Findings, 3rd year of her seal, the youngest quill on the spire. She possessed no vote, no voice, no standing, and one thing more dangerous than all three, the certification. No verdict entered the standing record until a transcript clerk certified that every word of it stood inside the certified record. Her people called the rule older than the court itself. She had sworn it with both hearts. She turned out of the huddle and went to find the chief clerk, and the wire sheet rode against her skin like a coal. 11 weeks earlier and 400 hours of lane light away, Selah Marsh was 20 minutes into her sleep shift when the survey tender Blue Wake struck what the watch officer logged in the last clean entry the ship ever made as an uncharted mass. It was not a mass. Masses do not aim. The shock threw Selah out of her bunk and into the conduit wall, and she was moving before she was awake because she was a junior navigator on a family ship, and the family ship was screaming. Not the people, the ship. The Blue Wake's alarm stack was a chorus her father's generation had tuned by hand, and every voice in it was singing at once. Hull, power, atmosphere, drive. By the time she pulled herself into the spine corridor, the gravity was already wrong, soft and tilting, and Tomas Vega shot past her in the dark like a fish, 12 years old, barefoot, towing his sleep net behind him because nobody had ever taught him to let go of things. She caught his ankle and reeled him in. Hold the rail. Count the hatches. 3 to the galley, Tomas said. His voice only shook once. He'd been born aboard. Counting hatches in the dark was a game every Blue Wake child could win. Go to 3. Stay at 3. The lights came back amber and one-eyed. Down the spine, she could see Deck Chief Marcus Okoye sealing the forward section with his shoulder against the wheel, and beyond him, through the last open hatch, a slice of the bridge. Captain Reyes upright in the con chair, gray head steady, voice level on the all-ship. That voice had talked the Blue Wake through reef storms and bad ice and 100 dull and dangerous years of survey work on the cheap side of the open lanes. It said, all hands brace and report. It said, we have been fouled by something and I am finding out what. It said, and this was the last thing it ever said to the whole ship, somebody is hailing us, and I don't like their grammar. The thing that had aimed itself at the Blue Wake was called a snare, though Selah would not learn the word for weeks. It had been drifting cold across the survey routes with a lure beacon, whispering the signature of natural ore, and when the tender slowed to log it, the snare had lit its engines and broken the Blue Wake's drive spine with a single-shaped impact, the way a man breaks the legs of an animal he intends to carry home. The carrier came in 9 hours later, while the family was still in vacuum suits cutting their own drive loose. It was long and gray and poxed with patch welds, and its name, stenciled in lane pigeon under a string of permit glyphs, was Gilt Promise. It did not hail with grammar anyone liked. It hailed with a boarding clamp. They came through the airlock in hard-shell suits with shock staves. 11 of them unhurried board. The one who walked in front had a shipmaster's sash and a voice like gravel poured slow. And he looked around the Blue Wake's scuffed, warm, hand-tuned spine corridor the way a man looks at weather. Unregistered biologicals, he said. To no one, to a recording cuff on his wrist. Open lane, no flag transponder. There was a transponder, and it was squawking the Survey Guild's flag on 3 bands, and his crew had shot it off the hull an hour before boarding. Salvage rights, retrieval permit 44, logged the find. Captain Reyes came down the spine to meet him with his hands open and empty, 60 years of patience in his spread fingers, and began to say the words you say. This is a flagged vessel. These are guild crew. There are children aboard. The shipmaster shot him, not in rage. That was the thing Selah's mind kept refusing then and after. There was no rage anywhere in it. The shipmaster shot Captain Reyes through the chest at 4 paces with the flat, unhurried competence of a man stamping a form, and stepped over him while he was still falling, and said to his crew, in the tone of a man who has done this many times and will do it many more, "Stock doesn't talk. Start with the small ones, they load easiest." Riln found Chief Clerk Dobin Marr in the certification vault, a room shaped like the inside of a shell, where the standing records master spools were racked in brass and the air was kept dry enough to crack young Clerk's membranes. Marr was old Hamat stock, heavy and gray-mottled, with a reading lens screwed into his third eye and 40 years of other people's words filed. Behind it, he was, in the ordinary run of things, the closest thing to a deity Riln's profession allowed. She put the wire sheet on his desk and stood with her quill hand behind her back, which among Sarwin meant I am about to be insubordinate, and I know it. Marr read it without touching it. He had heard about the leak, of course. The whole spire had heard. Recess gossip moved faster than wire. When he finished, he looked at her over the lens, and what was in his face was not surprise. That was the first wound of the day, though not the deepest. Dobin Marr was not surprised. "You shouldn't be holding that," he said. "Third paragraph," Riln said. "It cites 44K. I can read fourth. There is no 44K. I consolidated the docket on the 9th day. 44K became Exhibit 19. The conversion table was served on all parties. Anyone writing from the certified record, anyone writing in haste," Marr said, "with 3 numbering systems in his memory and a deadline on his neck, might reach for an old number. Assessors are not clerks. They misquote. We correct. That is the work. And the quote, Chief," she kept her voice, and the register clerks were trained to flat, dry the sound of paper. "It cost her. Recover, restrained, and hold to." That sentence exists in one document in this spire, the Holland deposition, withdrawn on day 6. Dead matter. The certified record says the boarding party found them on the bridge, under power, flying the ship. Wing Captain Vorn said it under oath, and I wrote it down with his hand. She did not raise the hand. Raising it would have been theater, and theater was for advocates. An assessor misquoting a number reaches for an old label on the right box. This reached into a box that was burned. Whoever wrote that paragraph was working from the Veleth brief, Chief, which means the verdict was drafted before the record closed. Which means, "Stop," Marr said, and the word was not loud, but the vault was built to carry whispers, and it carried this one into all the brass. For a moment, the only sound was the dehumidifiers ticking. "You are the 4th transcript clerk," Marr said at last, slowly, as though laying out tools. "You have held your seal for 3 years. I will tell you what you are proposing to do with it, because I am not certain you know. You are proposing to tell the adjudicature of Rex and findings 2 hours before it enters a verdict in the most watched salvage matter in a generation that one of its 3 assessors is either a forger or a fool, on the strength of a citation style, in a leaked sheet that officially does not exist, that you officially never read, in a matter where the Veleth carriage house has. And I am speaking now as someone who has watched that house operate since before your line was seated at this court, never once lost a finding it truly needed to win. The certification," Marr said, "is a quill stroke at the bottom of a page, made by clerks who wish to keep making quill strokes. In 40 years I have refused it once. The clerk who taught me refused it once. Both times the record was corrected quietly, in chambers, with apologies in both directions, and the verdicts came out the next day saying what they had always been going to say." He took the lens out of his eye, which he did rarely, and looked at her with all 3. "I have 11 clerks in my pool, and one rule that keeps them all employed, and none of them found floating in a coolant sump. We serve the record, not the outcome. Whatever you think you found, it dies in this room. The bench will be told there are citation errors requiring correction before entry. I will tell them myself, quietly. That is the whole of what the quill rule is for. And if the errors are not errors," Riln said. "If the verdict was bought and the correction only teaches the buyer to proofread," Marr put the lens back in. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady, and she filed that away in the margin column too. "Then 34 humans will be loaded onto the Pelham Rose by nightfall," he said, with cleaner footnotes. "Go back to your desk, 4th. The bell is going to ring." The bell did not ring. Not on time, and not the way anyone expected. What rang instead, 40 minutes later, was the spire's all-hall chime, and the voice of the prime assessor's marshal announcing that by order of Annuville the session of the adjudicature was continued to the next day's 3rd bell, pending an inquiry into the unauthorized circulation of matter purporting to be a ruling of this court. The broker's gallery groaned like a hold hull. Somewhere below on the exchange floor, a great deal of money that had been certain for 2 hours became uncertain again, and Riln, standing at her desk in the well of the Hall of Findings with her quill racked and her face arranged, understood 2 things at once. The first was that the leak itself had bought her a day. Whoever had sold the verdict early had, by the very act of selling it, forced the court to pause before reading it, a corruption so eager it had tripped over its own feet. The second she understood when the marshal read out who would conduct the inquiry into the leak. Second Assessor Karsh Devane, senior poison of the bench, 22 years on the spire, the member with, the phrase rolled out smooth as bearing oil, the greatest experience of chamber procedure. Karsh Devane, whose chambers had drafted the verdict. Riln did not know that yet, not as a fact, not as anything she could certify. But she watched the Olmec assessor receive his commission from the marshal with grave, unhurried sorrow, watched him promise the gallery that the integrity of the standing record was the floor every lane stood on, and she felt her margin column fill all by itself. The man assigned to hunt the leak was the man the leak most needed to protect. The Veleth House had not merely bought a verdict. It had bought the investigation of the verdict, in advance, the way you buy the fire brigade along with the torch. She went back to the clerk's alcove and did her work and let the spire's day fold over her, and in the folds where no one was looking, she began quietly, in the only way a fourth transcript clerk could, to build a record of her own. It helped that nobody saw clerks. Advocates performed for the gallery, assessors performed for history, witnesses performed for their own fear. Clerks were furniture that wrote. Riln fetched the consolidated index from the certification vault under cover of correcting a pagination fault and copied the ninth-day conversion table in her own hand and had the copy witnessed by the vault's timestamp, which knew no politics. Veleth Brief Number 44K, Converted Exhibit 19, Recovery Manifest, Guilt Promise. Service of the table acknowledged by all three claimants, 10th day, morning. Then she pulled the certified transcript of the 6th day and copied out, with stamps, the withdrawal. Advocate Maston Gee, for the Veleth Carriage House, rises to withdraw the deposition of Mate D. Holland in its entirety. Deposition struck. The bench so orders. And then the boarding testimony of the 11th day, Wing Captain Ezet Vorn, under oath, 8 words she had transcribed with her own aching hand and could have recited asleep. We found them on the bridge, flying her. 3 documents, a number that had died, a quote that had been struck, a fact that contradicted both. Laid side by side, they said one thing in a voice no advocate could perform over. The verdict was written before the trial finished by someone who never read the trial. The case those documents sat inside had begun, 11 days earlier, as the dullest kind of matter the adjudicature heard. A patrol cutter tows in a drifting carrier. 3 parties file claims on the find. The Veleth Carriage House, as permit holder and owner of record, wants its ship and its cargo. The cutter wants prize share for the tow. The Orsano Mutual Indemnity House, which had bonded the carrier's voyage and would be ruined by a total loss, wants the hull declared derelict and forfeit so its bond obligations die. Hull value, cargo value, percentages. The Hall of Findings heard 40 such matters a year, and the only unusual line in the docket was the description of the cargo, which the Veleth filing rendered in the Findings Code's oldest and coldest dialect. Biologicals unregistered, 41 units laden, 34 surviving, recovery manifest attached. For the first 2 days, that line had sat in the record and no one had touched it. The advocates argued lean priority. The gallery dozed. Riln transcribed and watched the 34 units sit in the holding gallery behind a rail of brass, silent in clean gray detention smocks, watching the procedure that would dispose of them with an attention that no cargo in the history of carriage had ever paid to anything. It was Wing Captain Vorn, blunt, irritated, a patrol officer with no money on anything, who had broken the dialect open on the 3rd day, under a routine question about the condition of the find. Condition of the find, Vorn had repeated, in the flat tone of a woman deciding she was done with a script. The find asked me for water rations and lane coordinates, Assessor. The find had its dead laid out under sheeting with their names written on their chests. The find requested, in correct lane pidgin, that I notify the Survey Guild. I have towed in grain, ore, frozen gene stock, and one time a shipment of ornamental birds, and none of it ever asked me for anything. You can rule them whatever the code lets you rule them. I'm telling this court what I found. I found a crew. That word had gone through the Hall of Findings like current through brine. Riln had felt it from her desk. The brokers leaning forward, the lane delegates of the found panel, 9 of them, seated in the old rec jury tradition to vote findings of fact, shifting in their alcove like a tide deciding. Advocate Gee had been on his feet within a breath, smooth as ever, moving to strike the characterization. The bench had let the words stand but cautioned the witness, and that night the first wire sheets had gone out from the broker's gallery, and the dull salvage matter had become the thing the whole Pelham Lane network now had money on. The case that would decide whether the word crew could belong to humans, or whether the oldest dialect in the findings code would keep them filed under cargo where the permits could reach them. 11 weeks earlier, in the darker between lanes, the cargo was learning the dimensions of hold 2. 12 paces by 15, Sella Marsh counted, when the Guilt Promises crew finally cut the work lights and left them the night cycle. Ribbed alloy walls sweating condensation. Carriage racks bolted in stacks of 3, each rack a shallow tray with a restraint web. Sized, she would not let her mind go soft about this. Sized for them, which meant the racks had been fitted in advance, which meant the snare and the boarding and the unhurried boredom of it all were not a crime that had happened to the Blue Wake, but an industry the Blue Wake had happened into. 40 of them had been marched through the clamp tunnel, and the 41st had been carried. The boarding crew had logged Captain Reyes's body with the same cuff they used to record fixtures, then let the stock bear it aboard, because a corpse left on a drifting wreck was evidence, and the Hollands were tidy about evidence. Engineer Priya Anand had been clubbed for moving toward a child too fast, and her left eye had closed to a weeping slit she refused to mention. The Holland crew had pulled the Blue Wake stores, stripped her drives, and holed her bow so she would read on any later scan as a natural loss. And somewhere in the 3rd hour of loading, while Sella stood in a sorting line with her hands zip-bound in front of her, the tender that had been her family's whole address in the universe had been cut loose to drift. She did not watch it go. She was watching the boy in front of her, Tomas, who had stopped shaking and gone silent in a way she liked much less. And she was doing what navigators do, which is build a chart out of whatever the instruments will give. The instruments gave her this. 11 crew on the Gilt Promise, of whom 7 stood watches. A shipmaster, Crame Holland, gravel-voiced, who never touched the stock himself once it was loaded. Handling was beneath the sash. A mate, his younger brother Dury, who flinched fractionally every time the shipmaster spoke, and who had twice, her margin column noted it, adjusted a restraint web so it would not cut a child's shoulder, doing it roughly, with cover cursing so no one would see it for what it was. Hatch seals operated on a 9-glyph code the guards keyed without shielding, because stock doesn't read. Meal slops twice a cycle, water thrice, and under everything, under the deck plates, a drive harmonic her engineer's ears could not stop cataloging. A fuel-starved flutter in the 3rd coil, the sound of a ship maintained by people who stole for a living and skimped even on the stealing. They feed us at the same bell every cycle. Priya murmured beside her in the dark on the 4th night through a swollen jaw. Guards rotate at the bell after. For about 200 breaths, there's one suit in this hold and he leans on the aft frame because his knees are bad. I've been counting. Count again tomorrow, Sella said. You think I haven't? Count again tomorrow, Sella said. And the night after, we get one try. We don't spend it on a chart we made angry. Priya was silent a while. The hold ticked and sweated. Somewhere down the rack stack, a man who had lost his wife in the boarding was crying with his fist in his mouth, trying to do it quietly, and failing, and nobody told him to stop. You sound like Reyes, Priya said at last. No, Sella said. The word came out level because she made it come out level. She was 24 years old, and the chart in her head was the only thing on this ship that belonged to them, and she would not let her voice crack its glass. Rice sounded patient because he was kind. I sound patient because I'm aiming. In the spire, on the night the verdict failed to be read, Riln Ovid worked late in the clerk's alcove and discovered who else was aiming. She had expected the inquiry into the leak to be theater, and it was, but theater needs stagehands. And Devane's chamber staff came down to the record vaults that evening with a requisition list that made the night clerk mutter and made Riln, 3 desks away with her lamp shaded, stop breathing through her spiracles so she could listen. The second assessor's amanuensis, a narrow, soft-stepping man called Amit Sorrel, wanted the gallery passes logged for the broker's tier. Reasonable. That was where the wire sheet had surfaced. He wanted the copying drum records for the lower print room. Reasonable. And he wanted, 3rd item, voice dropping on it, every transcript room duplicate of the Consolidated Exhibit Index, 9th day, with all service copies of the conversion table, recalled to chambers for review. The conversion table. The one document in the spire that could prove 44K was a corpse number. The inquiry into the leak was not hunting the leaker. It was hunting the evidence that the leaked verdict was forged, gathering up every copy of the ruler anyone might use to measure the lie. The night clerk, blessedly slow, said the index copies were charged out to the certification pool and couldn't be recalled without the chief clerk's. Quill and Sorrel said, soft as dust settling, that the chief clerk's quill would be no difficulty at all. And Riln sat in the lamp shadow with her copied, time-stamped witness table lying against her skin where the wire sheet had ridden that morning, and revised her understanding of her situation. Marr had said, it dies in this room. Marr had said he would tell the bench about the citation errors himself, quietly, in chambers. And if Marr's quiet word went to chambers, and chambers contained Karsh Devane, then the correction would arrive pre-strangled. And the only living copy of the 9th day table outside Devane's reach would be the one a 4th transcript clerk was wearing under her sleeve like a second pulse, she thought with a calm that surprised her. They are going to fix the verdict's grammar and read it tomorrow at third bell. Cleaner footnotes, same ramp. Then she thought about the boy who had coughed, and the woman with the navigator's burn scar who had moved without seeming to move, and about the one time in 11 days the human silence had broken in open court. The fifth day when Advocate Guy, sleek before the found panel, had referred for the third time in one speech to the recovery of strayed stock, and the scarred woman had stood up behind the brass rail, not shouting, not pleading. The bailiffs had started toward her and stopped because she wasn't doing anything. She had simply stood, and the 33 behind her had stood with her, in one motion the way a crew comes to attention when its dead are named, and the woman had said in Lane Pigeon, 4 words that Rilm's quill had taken down before the bench could rule them out of order. We buried our captain. That was all. They sat when the marshal ordered it. The bench struck the words as unsworn. But Rilm had transcribed the strike order, too, and her margin column had recorded what the standing record refused to, that the found panel's 9th delegate, a freight pilot widow from the caress yards, had looked at the standing humans and then down at her own folded hands, and had not looked at Advocate Guy again for the rest of the session. Quill strokes, margin columns, a time-stamped table under a sleeve. It was nothing set against a house that bought verdicts wholesale. It was, Rilm thought, racking her lamp, exactly the kind of nothing that had been certifying this court's honesty for 900 years, and tomorrow at third bell she was going to find out what it weighed. Before dawn, before the spire's first bell, the holding gallery had to be inventoried. That was the word the detention warrant used. Inventoried, and it fell to the transcript pool to countersign the bailiff's log each morning because cargo in dispute was cargo in the court's custody, and custody meant counting. For 11 days the duty had rotated among the clerks. Rilm had taken it twice. On the 12th morning she traded for it, giving up 2 rest shifts to a 5th year who couldn't believe his luck. The holding gallery was a converted bond warehouse 2 levels below the Hall of Findings, dry and clean and lightless at that hour except for the bailiff's lamps. The humans did not sleep in racks. The court, to its small credit, had issued cots, and the humans had arranged the cots themselves. And that arrangement was the first thing Rilm's margin column had ever recorded about them, back on her first inventory duty, because no warehouse in the galaxy had ever arranged itself like that. Children in the center. A ring of adults around the children. The cots at the ring's edge turned head outward, so that anyone entering the gallery at night would be seen first by open eyes. She walked the count with the duty bailiff, lamp held low, stepping soft. 34. The bailiff marked his log and went to the door to wait, bored, and Rilm stood a moment longer than the count required, because the woman with the navigator's burn scar was awake, sitting up on the outermost cot with a blanket around her shoulders, watching her the way she watched everything. Without fear and without hope, the way you watch weather. Rilm was not supposed to speak to the inventory. There was no rule against the inventory speaking to her. You're the one who writes, the woman said. Her Lane Pigeon was careful, learned fast and recently, the grammar of someone who had decided that the language of the people holding her was an instrument, and she would learn to play it. At the small desk, you wrote down what the patrol captain said. I write down everything, Rilm said. It's my function. We found them on the bridge, flying her. The woman said the 8 words the way Rilm's people recited lineage, exact. Weight on every stone of it. So they memorized the record too. Of course they did. The record was the only thing in this spire that had ever once told the truth about them. Does it matter? What gets written? Rilm looked at the lamp so she would not have to look at the burn scar, and heard herself answer with something that was not court dialect and was not in any oath she had sworn. Where I come from, she said, we say the spoken word is weather and the written word is stone. Things built on weather fall. The woman considered that. Behind her, deep in the ring of cots, a child turned over in his sleep, and without looking, the woman put one hand back toward the sound, a small, flat, settling gesture, be still, I'm here. And Rilm's quill hand ached with the uselessness of being unable to enter that gesture into any record in the world. Scylla Marsh, the woman said. Junior Navigator, Survey Tender Blue Wake, Guild Registry 993. That's also stone. Whatever happens at your third bell, somebody keep it written somewhere, that we had names. You'll keep it yourself, Rilm said, and was horrified to hear her own voice fray on the last word, a clerk's voice, trained to the register of paper. She straightened it. The count is concluded, she said, formal again, and turned and stopped, because she could not leave it there. The one who watches the door rotation, she said quietly, not turning around. The engineer. Tell her she counts well. Counting is most of my religion. She left before any human could answer, and missed, therefore, the look that went between Scylla Marsh and Priya Anand in the dark. The first look in 11 days that had anything in it besides arithmetic. 11 weeks earlier, on the ninth night cycle aboard the Gilt Promise, the arithmetic ran out and the try began at the feeding bell. It began with vomit, because that was the instrument they had. Two of the Blue Wake's deckhands had spent a day palming their water ration, drinking nothing, and when the slop trolley came through, hold 2 they were convincingly, spectacularly sick, and contamination in a stockhold was money, the only language the Holland crew heard. The guard with the bad knees keyed the hatch wide for the trolley man to drag the sick units to the scour stall, leaning on the aft frame as he always leaned, and for 200 breaths there was one suit in the hold, just as the count said, and the count had been made on 9 separate nights by an engineer, with one working eye, and the count was good. Sela had assigned herself the guard because she would not order anyone to do a thing she planned to keep her own hands clean of. He was half again her weight in a hard-shell suit, and it did not matter, because Marcus Okoye came off the top rack onto his shoulders the moment his head turned, and what Sela took was not the man but the stave, twisting it from his gauntlet with both hands while the shock setting was still keyed to low. The courtesy setting, the one for moving stock that loads easiest. She put it against the seam at his collar and held it there until he stopped fighting, and held him after, her own hands shaking now that they were allowed to, while Priya stripped the cuff from his wrist and read off the 9-glyph hatch code she had. Watched keyed unshielded 40 times in 9 days because stock doesn't read. Say it back, Priya whispered. And 4 voices in the dark said the 9 glyphs back without a flaw, the way Blue Wake children recited hatch counts, because some games a family ship teaches turn out not to be games. What happened in the next quarter hour, the certified record of the adjudicature of wrecks and findings, would later contain in 3 competing versions. There was the version in the withdrawn Holland deposition, a stock riot, a frenzy, units swarming the watch. There was the version Advocate Guy would gesture at for days, all blood and madness, the holds boiling over. And there was the version that was stone, the one that came out under oath, late, from the mouths that had lived it, and the stone version was quieter and far worse for the Veleth house than any frenzy, because the stone version had a chart under it. They took the watch stations one at a time, in rotation order, in the dark, with stolen staves on the courtesy setting. They took the engine room without a blow struck, because the duty tech was asleep against the 3rd coil, lulled by the fuel-starved flutter he had stopped hearing years ago, and Priya Anand could have heard dead. They took 6 of the 11 before any alarm sounded, and the alarm, when it came from the galley, where the cook fell over a stool, and what it summoned into the spine corridor was the shipmaster himself, Crame Holland, gravel-voiced, sash askew, a slug pistol in his fist. The same fist, the same pistol, the same unhurried competence that had stepped over Aldous Reyes 11 weeks of forever ago. He found Sela Marsh standing at the junction with a stave she did not raise. "Stock," he said, almost wonderingly, and lifted the pistol, and Dury Holland shot his brother through the shoulder from the galley hatch. The mate stood there afterward with the slug thrower sagging in his grip, shaking the way his brother had never once shaken, and what he said, the record would have it eventually, sworn and certified, was not an apology and not a plea. He looked at the man bleeding on the deck plates, the man who had broken animals' legs for a living across 40 years of open lane, and he said, "You shot a man whose hands were open. I watched you do it. I've watched you do it 11 times. And then he laid the gun on the deck, slid it across to Sela's feet, and sat down against the bulkhead with his hands in plain sight, the first of the Gilt Promise's crew to surrender to its cargo. Crame Holland did not die in the uprising. That mattered later, in the stone version, more than almost anything. He died 4 days after it, of the wound turning septic in a ship whose medical stores his own thrift had gutted. Died in the crew mess the humans had converted to an infirmary, on a cot under a blanket, with a 15-year-old Blue Wake apprentice changing the dressing on his shoulder because the humans' medic ordered rounds, kept even for him. The recording cuff they had taken off the first guard captured 20 minutes of his last lucid watch, and in it the gravel voice, very weak, asked the boy why, and the boy, who had helped carry Captain Reyes's body to the cold locker with his own hands, answered in the flat, scoured voice of a child done crying, "Because we're not you." 11 of the Gilt Promise's crew had begun the voyage. 1 died in the uprising itself, the trolley man who went for a blade and lost the only fair fight of the night. The shipmaster made 2. The remaining 9 were locked, fed, watered, and doctored in Hold 1 in better conditions than Hold 2 had ever been keyed to, and Sela Marsh posted a watch rotation over them and entered it in a log, because her captain had kept logs and his captain before him, and if the universe ever asked the Blue Wake's family what they had done in the dark between lanes, the family would answer in stone. In the spire, at second bell of the 12th day, 1 hour before the verdict's reading, Dobin Marr came looking for his 4th transcript clerk, and found her desk empty, her lamp cold, and the certification vault's night log showing her seal against a withdrawal that made his old hearts lurch. The master conversion table, 9th day, charged out to R. Ovet, purpose stated in the tidy quill of a third-year clerk who had just bet her line, her seal, and quite possibly her breathing on a single sheet of stamped paper. Required for certification review, prior to entry of verdict. He went down through the spire fast, robes gathered, past the brokers already packing the gallery stairs, and he was rehearsing the order, return it, burn the copies, stand down, I will handle the bench. When he turned into the lower print corridor and stopped, because Amit Sorrel was standing at the junction ahead, soft-stepping Sorrel with 2 chamber bailiffs behind him, and Sorrel was not waiting for Mar. Chief Clerk, Sorrel said pleasantly. The second assessor requires the transcript pool's index copies before third bell, all of them. There seems to be one unaccounted for. And Dobin Mar, 40 years a servant of the record, one refusal spent in a whole long careful life, heard himself say in the register of paper. The certification pool answers to the quill rule, not to chambers. If the second assessor wants the working documents of a certifying clerk, he may ask for them in open session, on the record, with the gallery watching. I'll be glad to write it down. Sorrel's pleasantness did not move, but something behind it recalculated. Chamber bailiffs could compel an advocate, a witness, a broker. The certification pool was the one body in the spire that even an assessor touched only through procedure, because the pool's quills sat under every verdict the lanes had ever enforced, and the day a chamber strong-armed a certifying clerk was the day every enforced verdict in 900 years grew a question mark. Sorrel knew it. Whoever had sent Sorrel knew it better, and had sent him anyway, before third bell, in a corridor without witnesses, which told Dobin Mar more about the state of things in Devane's chambers than any leak ever could. They were not confident. They were cleaning. Before third bell, Chief Clerk, Sorrel said softly, and withdrew, and Mar stood in the print corridor until his heart settled, and then went to find the clerk he had ordered to let it die. He found her in the smallest transcript room, the one with no window and one door, and she had not run and she had not hidden. She had laid it all out on the copy table in certification order, docketed, tabbed, cross-referenced, the way evidence is laid for a quill audit, the master conversion table with the vault seal, her witnessed copy with the timestamp, the certified transcript of the 6th day, the withdrawal of the Holland deposition, struck, the bench so orders, the certified transcript of the 11th day, borne under oath, the bridge, flying her, and at the end of the row, alone in its shroud of broker gray, the leaked verdict with its dead number and its grave quote. Third paragraph, flagged in clerk's blue. Mar walked the row twice without speaking. Old Hamet read with their hands as much as their eyes. His blunt gray fingers hovered over each seal, each stamp, never touching, weighing. Devane's man just tried to recall every copy of the conversion table in the spire, he said at last. I know, Riln said. I heard the requisition last night. That's why the master is on this table and not in the vault. She kept her quill hand still at her side. You said it dies in the room, Chief. The room got bigger on its own. You understand what this is now. It wasn't a question. He picked up the leaked sheet at last by the corner the way her own people held what stains. Not an error. Not even a bribe in the old style. One finding bought between gentlemen. They drafted the ruling in a claimant's office, leaked it to position the markets, and tasked the bench's own inquiry with eating the proof. If you put your quill under a refusal at third bell, you are not correcting the record. You are accusing the adjudicature of selling a species. No, Chief. Riln heard her own voice come out in the register of paper, and was glad of every dry year of training that had built it. I'm declining to certify a citation that does not exist in the certified record. That's all the quill rule lets me say, so it's all I'll say. The accusation isn't mine. The verdict makes it about itself, in writing in its own third paragraph. I just refuse to swear it's stone when I can see its weather. Mar set the sheet down. For a long moment, the only sound was the copy table's lamp buzzing, and when he spoke again it was not the chief clerk's voice but something older, and more tired and very nearly proud. I refused once, he said, year 9 of my seal. A wreck fraud matter, one forged survey line, and I was right, and they corrected it in chambers, and the assessor who forged it retired with honors 4 years later, and the house that paid him owns half the cress yards today. I told myself the record was served. I have told myself that for 31 years. He took the reading lens from his third eye, folded it, and put it in his robe, deliberately, a man clearing his sight before work. The pool stands behind its certifying clerk at entry, all 11 quills. That is also the quill rule, the half nobody has needed allowed in living memory. I'll need 2 hours, and I am taking your tabs as the audit order. Fourth, Riln. It was the first time in 3 years he had used her name. When the moment comes, it will come fast, and the whole weight of that hall is built to make a junior clerk sit down. The house will roar. The bench will frown. The procedure will offer you a dozen soft exits, everyone marked with respect. What will you do? She said. Counting is most of my religion. 11 weeks earlier, the guilt promise hung dead slow in the dark with a crew of cargo and counted what it had. It had 9 prisoners, 2 bodies in the cold locker beside their own 7, a third coil that fluttered like a sick lung, and a navigation core locked under a Velith fleet cipher that no engineer alive was going to sweet talk. That was the wall Sella hit on the first free morning, sitting in the dead shipmaster's chair with the chart she had built in her head for 9 nights, finally allowed out onto a real plotting table. The ship would answer the helm, but the core would not tell the helm where anything was. The Lane Beacon Almanac, the route library, the registered approach keys for every port in reach, ciphered, all of it. They had taken the ship, and the ship was a sealed room. We can fly blind along the snare's own backtrail, Priya said. Her eye had opened to a slit. She'd set the bone of her own cheek with tape and never once filed a complaint about it in the log. Dead reckoning off the drive records. It'll be ugly. Marcus asked. Home's 400 hours of lane light, the wrong side of nowhere. And this hull is a wanted hull the moment anyone reads its transponder. We limp into any port flying Velith glyphs, and we're back in the racks by supper with paperwork. The argument that followed was the only one the new crew of the Guilt Promise ever had at full voice, and Sela let it run because Reyes had let arguments run, and because under it she was reading the one document the Hollands had never thought to cipher. The carriage racks themselves, stamped batch plates, maintenance glyphs, rack assemblies fitted in advance, sized for a human frame, and worn. Webbing replaced twice, Trailiner scoured down to bare alloy by use. The industry had a history, and a history meant a route, and a route meant the snare's back trail led somewhere worth being seen at. We don't run home, she said, and the bridge went quiet. Blind reckoning home kills us in the dark, and nobody ever knows. We run the back trail the other way, out to the Pelham Convergence, the public lane, the one place in reach where there's traffic that isn't theirs. Patrol sweeps, freight, guild hulls. We go where the eyes are. She put her finger on the plotting table, on the bright braided line of the public lane, and said the thing that the certified record would one day hold up to the light of a packed hall. And we go loud. Every running light this hull owns, every band the transmitter reaches. We are done being a natural loss. It took 26 days, and the third coil died twice. And Priya brought it back twice with parts cannibalized from the snare tender's own launch, and they fed their prisoners every bell of every cycle. And the broadcast ran the whole time on a 9-day loop of stubborn battery and stripped antenna gain. Tomas Vega wrote it in the end. The adults had drafted distress codes and guild ciphers and legal formulae, and the boy who had been born aboard listened to all of it, and then said the smart people words all sounded like a ship talking, and ships were what the bad men owned, so it should sound like people. The loop that went out on every open band the Guilt Promise could reach, over and over, in plain lane pigeon for 26 days was this. We are the crew of the survey tender Blue Wake. 41 names. Listen, and then the names. All 41, the living and the dead together. Read one to a breath in a 12-year-old steady recorded voice, Aldous Reyes first. And at the end of the names, we are not cargo. We are coming to the light, and then it began again. The stave of Yend heard it 11 hours out from the convergence, where the public lane's beacon chain starts to thicken and even a poxed gray slaver of a hull can no longer be nobody. Wing Captain Zezet Vorn would testify, 11th day, certified stone, that her signals officer could not at first classify the transmission because distress calls beg and manifest list, and this did neither. It simply was on loop like a lighthouse made of names. The cutter ran the transponder, Velith carriage registry, permit glyphs, flagged overdue and presumed total loss, a dead ship, broadcasting the names of other dead people, decelerating carefully into the most watched stretch of lane in the sector, with every running light burning. Vorn matched velocity, hailed and got back one sentence in lane pigeon, a young woman's voice, level, boarding clamps clear, patrol. Come and count us. They came through the clamp tunnel armored staves hot, because the manifest said stock and the transponder said stolen and nothing about any of it said safe. Vorn would testify to the order of what her boarding party found, because the order was the whole of it. They found the spine corridor lit and empty, deck plates scrubbed, and lane pigeon direction glyphs hand-painted on the bulkheads. Infirmary. Prisoners. Children. This way to bridge. They found hold 1 secured and 9 prisoners alive in it, fed, doctored, and one of them, the mate, the Holland, standing at the grate asking, before anything else, whether his brother's body had kept in the cold. They found the infirmary rounds log open on its cotside stand, last entry 40 minutes old. They found the cold locker dignified. 9 bodies under sheeting, names written plain on every chest, 2 of the names, Holland crew names, lettered in the same careful hand as the rest. and they found the bridge crewed. Watch posted, log open, helm manned, a boy at the comms station with his finger still on the loop key, and standing at the plotting table, waiting, unarmed, 24 years old, the acting master of the Guilt Promise, who looked down the lit corridor at 6 armored boarders and all the law in the lanes behind them and said the words Riln Ovid would one day copy out at second bell with stamps on them, 8 words, Stone, Sella Marsh, Survey Tender Blue Wake. This crew surrenders nothing, we're requesting escort. At 2:30 bell on the 12th day, a chamber page in Devane Gray found Riln Ovid at her desk in the well of the hall and informed her, with the courtesy pages reserved for the doomed, that the second assessor wished a brief word regarding transcript readiness before session, not an order. Orders left records, a wish left nothing. She went because refusing would have told them what she carried, and because the certification audit was already moving under Mars Quill 2, floors below, and every minute a chamber spent wishing at her was a minute it spent not looking down. Karsh Devane's chambers were the oldest on the spire, paneled in wood that had crossed 400 hours of lane light as ballast in some ancestral hull, and the second assessor received her standing at the window, against the amber wall of Yen, holding a copy of Nothing at All. Up close, he was gray-crested and heavy-browed and gentle-voiced, and he spoke to her for some minutes about the weight of the day, the eyes of the lanes, the tragedy of the leak, the importance. He turned from the window on the word, of the record entering clean. Your chief clerk trains his pool well, Devane said. Procedure first. It is the spine of everything. But you've been a quill long enough to know. Fourth, that procedure has a body around it. Houses. Markets. 11 clerks who eat. A court only works if it is believed. And belief is a cargo that doesn't survive rough handling. If a junior clerk were to, imagine it, make a scene at entry, on some point of citation housekeeping, the point would be corrected in an afternoon and forgotten in a week. The scene would be remembered for 30 years. Not as diligence. As the day the quills got above the bench, every house in the lanes would conclude the adjudicature could not govern its own well. And the clerk, he paused kindly, the pause of a man stepping around something unpleasant on a floor. The clerk would carry it on her seal. Forever. Her line after her. Sarwin lines sit at this court on sufferance of good behavior. It would be a poor trade, a career for a footnote. You see the shape of it. Riln stood with her quill hand behind her back and looked at the gentle, heavy face and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that she was being shown the inside of the machine, that this, exactly this, was the voice that had spoken to Mar 31 years ago, and to Mar's teacher before him the soft, reasonable voice of the body around the procedure, and that it won, it had nearly always won. Not by forging anything, but by making the quill weigh its own small life against the whole heavy world and sit down. I see the shape of it, Assessor, she said, in the register of paper. Good, Devane said, turning back to his window. Then we understand each other. Transcript readiness? The record is ready to be served, Assessor, Riln said, which was true, and which was not what he had asked, and she counted her own heartbeats, both lines of them, all the way back down to the hall, and they were steady, and she wrote that in her margin column, too. The Hall of Findings at third bell on the 12th day held more breathing bodies than at any session in its history. The broker's tier was packed to the rails. The lane delegates of the found panel sat 9 abreast in their alcove, and below them the claimants' tables. Mast and Gee for the Veleth carriage house, sleek and unworried, flanked by house factors in carriage green. The Ursano Mutual bench, gray and watchful. Wing Captain Vorn alone at the cutter's table in patrol blue, arms folded, wearing the expression of a woman who had towed something into port and would tow it right back out given the smallest excuse. Behind the brass rail, in clean gray smocks, 34 humans sat in their ring without being told to form one children innermost. And at the small desk in the well, beneath the bench, the 4th transcript clerk racked her quill, squared her tabs, and watched the 3 assessors enter under the gallery's roar like weather coming over a ridge. Prime Assessor Anu Vel was Kethrin, ancient, granite pale, with a voice like a door closing somewhere far down a corridor. She let the marshal still the hall, addressed the leak in 11 cold words. The inquiry continues. This court is not moved by what brokers print, and then did precisely what Dobin Mar had predicted, what the machine had been always going to do. She announced that the bench's draft ruling had been reviewed in chambers overnight, that certain clerical errors of citation had been identified and corrected, and that the corrected verdict of the adjudicature of recs and findings in the matter of the carrier guilt promise would now be read and entered into the standing record. Cleaner footnotes. Same ramp. The reading took most of an hour, and Riln transcribed every word of it with a steady hand, which was its own kind of out-of-body experience, hearing the sentences she had carried against her skin for a day come down from the bench in Anu Vel's far door voice with their numbers laundered. Exhibit 19 now, not 44K. The grave quote gone, smoothed into a paraphrase. The units were recovered in circumstances consistent with stock and carriage. Whoever had spent the night correcting had done exactly what corrections do, fixed everything that could be checked, and changed nothing that mattered. Finding for the Velith carriage house. Escaped registered stock to be returned to the permit holder. Transferred to the Pelham Rose upon entry. She heard the humans behind the rail not move. 34 bodies holding still is louder than a gallery roaring. It has a pressure, like depth. The verdict will be entered, Anuvel said at last, and the marshal called the oldest formula the spire owned, the one that had closed every matter for 900 years. Words worn so smooth that nobody in living memory had ever heard them as a question. The record stands ready. The clerk certifies. Rilnovet stood up at the small desk and did not pick up her quill. The clerk cannot certify. Prime assessor. It is a strange thing to drop a stone into a machine and hear, before anything breaks, simply silence, not the hush of awe, but the specific total silence of several hundred minds failing to find a precedent. The marshal looked at her, then at the bench, then back at her, with the wounded expression of a man whose liturgy has stopped working partway through. Up in the broker's tier, somebody whispered, "What did she say?" and was not answered. At the Velith table, Maston Guy's smile remained in place a full breath after the rest of his face had left it, and at the cutter's table, Wing Captain Vorn slowly unfolded her arms, sat forward and began, visibly, to enjoy herself. "The clerk," said Anuvel, in a register that had crushed senior advocates into their boots, "will state her grounds. Quill rule, prime assessor. No verdict enters the standing record until a transcript clerk certifies that every citation in it stands within the certified record." Riln's voice did not perform. She had trained it in the driest room in the spire. She picked up the first tab. The verdict, as read, cites Exhibit 19, the recovery manifest of the carrier guilt promise, for the proposition that the persons behind the rail were recovered in circumstances consistent with stock and carriage. The certified record contains sworn testimony of the 11th day, Wing Captain Evorn, describing the actual circumstances of recovery. She read the 8 words into the hall, slowly at transcription pace, the pace that lets every breathing body in a room write a thing onto itself. "We found them on the bridge, flying her." She set the tab down. "The clerk has compared the verdict's account of recovery against every recovery. Account in the certified record. It does not match any of them. It matches word for word in its original draft and in substance as corrected. One document only, a deposition withdrawn and struck on the 6th day. Struck matter is outside the record. The clerk cannot certify a verdict built on it. That is the whole of my grounds and the whole of my function." "The original draft," said Karstavain from the bench gently into the stillness, and there Riln thought, there the first mistake, because no one in that hall had said anything about an original draft except the leaked sheet that officially did not exist, and the second assessor had just compared the corrected verdict against it from memory. "The clerk refers to broker rumor. Is the integrity of this court now hostage to forged flimsies and a third-year quill's reading of them?" "The clerk refers to the certified record," Riln said, "which is the only thing the quill rule permits me to read in this chair. The verdict, as read aloud 1 hour ago, paraphrases struck matter. I do not require any flimsy to see it. I transcribed the deposition before it was struck. I transcribed the striking. I transcribed the testimony that contradicts it. All 3 are under seal on this desk, and I will serve them to the bench the moment it asks. And if the bench does not ask..." Devane's voice stayed gentle. "If the bench instructs the clerk that paraphrases interpretation, that interpretation belongs to assessors, and that her function is the quill, not the weighing." Down at the pool bench along the well's south wall, where 11 clerks of the certification pool had filed in quietly during the reading, Chief Clerk Dobin Marr rose to his feet, and his pool rose with him, all of them, in one motion the way a crew stands when its dead are named. "Then the pool joins the refusal," Marr said, "and the quill rule answers the bench itself. Nothing enters the standing record today. The rule has 2 halves, assessors. It has simply been a very long time since anyone needed the second one." The hall broke then, the broker's tier first, a surf of voices, factors shouting into wire cuffs as the certainty they had bought twice in 2 days died a second death. Maston Guy on his feet, objecting in his beautiful courtroom baritone to the spectacle, the irregularity, the contempt, the marshal hammering for order and getting it slowly in pieces. Through all of it, the 9 delegates of the found panel did not make a sound. Riln, who watched rooms for a living, watched them instead of the storm. The freight pilot widow from the caress yards had taken out her own copy of the docket index and was going down it with a blunt finger, line by line. 2 seats along, the miners' combine delegate leaned over to the pilot's sodality delegate and asked something, and the sodality delegate 20 years running crews up and down the very lanes whose law was being tested, did not whisper back. He said it aloud, flat, into a lull the marshal's hammer had just made, and the words carried to the dome. She's right, though. Check your service copy. The manifest's been Exhibit 19 since the 9th day. So who's still working off 44K? Quietly, all along the found panel's alcove, dockets began to open. That was the moment Riln entered it into the transcript with the time mark, 4th hour, 12th day, and her margin column entered it as the moment the room turned. Not a gasp, not a shout, just 9 practical lane folk, and then 100 brokers, and then the Orsano bench, and then everyone except the Veleth table, checking the number for themselves. A court can survive being accused. What it cannot survive is a room full of people discovering they can check. Prime Assessor Anuvel let them check. She was 900 years of institution in one granite body, and she understood exactly what was draining out of her hall, and that only one thing would stop the bleed. She overruled Guy without looking at him. Then she did the thing that made Riln's both hearts clench with something that was almost painful respect. She turned the quill rule loose in open session, on the record with the gallery watching. The clerk will serve her documents to the bench, she said. All of them. The court will conduct the comparison aloud. It took 40 minutes, and it was the driest 40 minutes of theater the Pelham Lanes would talk about for a generation. The master conversion table, vault sealed, time stamped. 44K becomes Exhibit 19, 9th day, served on all parties the 10th day morning, acknowledgement signed, Guy's own quill among them. The certified 6th-day transcript. The Holland deposition withdrawn before it could be sworn, struck, the bench so orders, the striking signed by all 3 assessors, Devane's seal among them. The 11th day testimony Vorn the bridge flying her. And then, because Anuvel was thorough the way Old Stone is thorough, the comparison nobody could perform over. The corrected verdict's recovery paragraph read aloud, beside the struck deposition's recovery paragraph. Sentence against sentence, by the marshal, in a voice trained to carry liturgy. Consistent with stock and carriage, restrained in carriage configuration, hold 2. The paraphrase had changed the feathers and kept the bird. The deposition was struck, Anuvel said at last, into a hall gone very still, on the 6th day. Testimony closed on the 11th. The bench's draft was circulated for review on the morning of the 12th. She paused. And the pause had centuries in it. A draft that quotes a struck document was written by a hand that possessed the struck document and trusted it. The bench did not possess it. It was withdrawn before service on the bench. Her great pale head turned, slowly, with the patience of geology, toward her own left side. One chamber requisitioned the claimant's filings in their original numbering, for inquiry purposes, yesterday evening. The requisition is logged. Second assessor. What Riln remembered afterward was not Devane's face, which never lost its gentle gravity, but his hands, which began, very carefully, to square the papers in front of him, edge to edge, the small tidy motion of a man whose body had already left for the exits while his voice stayed to negotiate. He spoke of the appearance of impropriety. He spoke of malicious construction, of coincidence, of his decades. He requested, gently, reasonably, his last gentle, reasonable act on any bench anywhere, that the matter be examined in chambers. This court has seen what becomes of matters examined in your chambers, Anuvel said. The marshal will seal them. Wing Captain Vorn. The patrol officer was on her feet before her name had finished crossing the well, and something in the economy of it said she had been waiting 11 days to be useful in exactly this way. The adjudicature requests patrol assistance in securing the chambers, files, wire records, and person of the second assessor, pending referral to the Pelham Concourse. The amanuensis Amit Sorrel as well. The print room drum logs from last night will want explaining, and I find I want them explained by someone under oath. They took Karsh Devane out through his own paneled door, unhurried, correct, no shackles. The lanes did not shackle assessors. They did something worse. They documented them. And the last thing he did before the door was look down into the well at the small desk, at the third-year quill standing behind her tabs, with an expression Riln spent years afterward trying to file. It was not hatred, it was bafflement. He had shown her the inside of the machine, the body around the procedure, the weighing that had won for 31 years and 300, and she had weighed it all exactly as instructed, and then put her quill down anyway, and somewhere in the gray-crested gentle head the arithmetic still would not resolve. Counting is most of my religion, she thought at the closing door, and did not say, and wrote the time mark instead. It should have ended there, and the machine tried to let it. Guy was up within moments, graceful in disaster, proposing the obvious sane procedural mercy. Strike the tainted verdict, impanel a fresh bench, rehear the claims in due course, next session, next quarter, the units of course to remain in custody meanwhile, or better, in the permit holder's care as bonded property pending. No, said Anuvel. She said it before he finished the sentence, and then she sat with her hands flat on the bench for a long moment, an old granite woman looking down into the well of her hall, at the brass rail, at the ring of gray smocks behind it, children innermost, every adult face turned up toward her, silent, the way they had been silent for 12 days. And Riln watched 900 years of institutional caution fight something older in the Catherine's face, and lose. The adjudicature has spent 12 days asking who owns what was found aboard carrier Guilt Promise, she said. It has been the wrong question since the third day, when an officer of the patrol told this court under oath that what she found was a crew. Every party has felt the true question under the floor of this hearing. The bench has felt it. The bench ruled it outside the code because the code has no column for it, and the bench has been taught today by its own clerks what happens to verdicts built over a void. Her farfador voice came down like a keel touching ground. The claims cannot be found until the thing claimed is named. The adjudicature therefore puts to its found panel, as a finding of fact under the rec jury tradition, the antecedent question: are the 34 beings in the custody of this court property, or are they persons? Proofs reopen at fifth bell. The panel will hear everything. This court has been leaked, forged, bought at, and shamed in one day, so it will do the one thing left that no house can purchase. It will find out loud. At fifth bell, the hall was fuller than law allowed, and the marshal had given up enforcing the law about it. Word had gone down the spire and out along the wire. The adjudicature was going to rule on what humans were. Dock crews stood 3 deep at the public doors. The Survey Guild's local factor had arrived with the recording secretary. Someone said the Pelham Concourse itself had opened a wire channel to listen, and for once the rumor was true. Wing Captain Azat Vorn was recalled first, and this time nobody moved to strike her characterizations, and this time she had brought the thing the first hearing had ruled unnecessary to play in full. The helm record of the Stave of Yend, 11 hours of signal and 3 hours of boarding, certified by Patrol Seal, projected onto the great cyan plate above the well where, for 11 days, the claimant's diagrams of hull values and lean priorities had glowed. The hall heard the loop first. That was Vorn's choice. Riln understood it the moment the speakers woke. Before any image in the dark of the dimmed plate, the Hall of Findings heard what a patrol signals officer had heard 11 weeks earlier in the thinning static of the convergence approach. A 12-year-old's recorded voice, level, unhurried, reading names. We are the crew of the survey tender Blue Wake. 41 names, listen, Aldous Reyes, and on, one to a breath through all 41, while several hundred breathing bodies in a packed amber-lit hall held very still, and behind the brass rail 34 people who had heard the loop 900 times bowed their heads as one and moved their lips with it, every name, the living and the dead together, because some litanies do not wear out. We are not cargo, we are coming to the light. Then the images. The gray hull growing in the cutter's scopes with every running light burning, a slaver's silhouette dressed like a festival barge, decelerating with the careful grammar of a helm that wanted no one frightened. The clamp tunnel. The lit spine corridor with its hand-painted glyphs. The plate showed them twice the height of a delegate. Infirmary, prisoners, children. This way to bridge, and Riln heard the found panel's alcove make a sound, low, involuntary. 9 practical lane folk recognizing in one breath what kind of mind paints directions for its own borders. Hold 1, and the 9 fed prisoners, and the mate at the grate asking after his brother's body. The cold locker, 9 sheeted forms, the names lettered on every chest, and Vorn's flat voice over the image. 2 of those are Holland crew assessors. Same hand wrote all 9. They lettered their enemies' names with the same care as their own. The rounds log, the watch bill. And last, the bridge, and the boy at the comms with his finger on the loop key, and the young woman at the plotting table turning to face 6 armored boarders, unarmed, steady, while the helm record's audio caught the 8 words and the whole Hall of Findings heard the moment both timelines of the last 11 weeks had been converging on all along, the moment Riln had first met as ink and now met as a living voice filling the dome. Sela Marsh, Survey Tender Blue Wake. This crew surrenders nothing. We're requesting escort. I've boarded 41 distressed hulls in 20 years of patrol, Vorn said into the quiet that followed. I have never once been requested an escort by cargo. The panel asked me this morning what convinced me. Nothing convinced me. Conviction is for arguments. I stepped onto a working ship with a posted watch, a kept log, doctored prisoners, honored dead, and a master at her plot. You don't get convinced of a crew, assessors. You get met by one. I was met. Maston Guy rose to cross-examine, and Riln gave him this much in her margin column. He was brave with the courage of the very well-paid, and he did his work. Wasn't it true the so-called watch bill was unverifiable? That stock species mimics structure under stress? That the patrol captain's prize share gave her every reason to romance the find into a crew? since prize law paid better on rescue than on retrieval. Vorn took the last one without blinking and answered it in the one currency the broker's tier respected without translation. Other way round. Advocate. Check the schedules. Retrieval bounty on 34 units of registered stock pays my cutter triple what an escort assist pays. I'm testifying against my own purse. Care to tell the panel who's testifying for theirs? The laugh that went around the hall had teeth in it, and the teeth were pointed at the carriage green table, and Riln watched 2 of the 9 delegates write something down. Then the adjudicature called Dury Holland, and the hall found out why the Veleth House had been willing to buy a verdict wholesale rather than let this matter run one honest day. He came up from patrol custody in a witness smock, the surviving mate of the Gilt Promise, brother of its dead master, and he swore the oath in a voice like his brother's gravel run through finer mesh. And then he did the thing he had been refusing to do since the 6th day, the refusal that had gotten his deposition withdrawn. He testified to what was true instead of what was written for him. The snare was not improvisation. It was inventory. Veleth Fleet Stores, serial stamped, drawn against the permit. The Gilt Promise had run the route 4 times before the Blue Wake. The racks were worn because the racks were used. The phrase unregistered biologicals was not a description but an instruction. You shot the transponder off the hull first, and then the biologicals were unregistered. The permits were written that way on purpose. He said it plainly, looking at the carriage green table, written loose by the house's own lane, counsel so that anything caught in the open dark could be filed as findable, and the house's factors had a price sheet for human stock the way they had a price sheet for ore, and his brother had carried it folded in his sash, and it was in patrol evidence now, and its heading did not say if. It said per unit by age band. You participated, Guy said on cross. Soft and lethal. 4 voyages. You fitted those racks with your own hands. The panel is being asked to take its facts from a slaver. Yes, Dury Holland said. No flinch left in him. He had spent it all in a galley hatch 11 weeks ago. That's exactly what the panel's being asked. Who else would know? You want the truth about a trade advocate. You can't ask the cargo. Your house made sure of that 11 times over, and you won't ask the customers. That leaves us. He looked up past Guy at the 9. I watched my brother shoot a gray-haired man whose hands were open, and I logged it as handling loss, because that's the column the form gave me. 11 voyages of columns. Then his ship got taken away from him by the freight, and the freight pulled me out of a hatch I was hiding in, and I waited to be shown what we'd have done to them. They put me in a warm hold and fed me at every bell, and their medic set my wrist, and when my brother's shoulder went bad, their children changed his dressings until he died, and then they wrote his name on his chest in fair lettering and put him in the cold beside their own captain. His voice did not break. It did something stranger. It leveled like a keel finding water. Your house paid me to call them units for 4 years, and they paid me nothing to call my brother by his name when no one of my own blood was left to do it. The panel can decide which of those is the way persons behave. I know my answer. I'm sitting in it. The hall did not erupt. It had gone past eruption into the deep water quiet of a room that knows it is hearing the thing it will be remembered for. And into that quiet, the adjudicature played the last of the patrol's certified evidence. 20 minutes from a recording cuff, taken off a guard in an uprising, ending in a crew mess converted to an infirmary, where a gravel voice gone very weak asked a 15-year-old why, and a child's scoured, level voice answered, because we're not you. In the found panel's alcove, the freight pilot widow from the caress yards closed her docket, laid her blunt hand flat on its cover, and looked down at the ring of gray smocks behind the brass rail with an expression Riln transcribed in the only column that would take it. The vote had not been called, but Rilnovic counted rooms for a living, and the room had already voted. Maston Guy knew it too, and so he did what the very well-paid do. When the facts have left the building, he went to the architecture. He rose for the Veleth carriage house one last time, and he was, Riln conceded, magnificent, in the way a hull is magnificent as it goes down with its lights on. The panel's sympathies, he said, were human. He begged the hall's pardon. The word had escaped its pen, were natural, were even perhaps correct. But sympathy was not jurisdiction. The adjudicature of wrecks and findings was a salvage court. Its writ ran to hulls, cargo, liens, and bounties. Personhood was a status conferred by the Lane Accord, and the Lane Accord conferred it upon the registered species of signatory polities. Earth was not a signatory. Humanity was not registered. However the panel might feel, the column for these beings did not exist, and no finding of fact by 9 Lane delegates in a Port Anchorage courtroom could write a new column into the galaxy's founding instrument. If the humans wish to be persons, let their distant government petition the Pelham Concourse, and let the concourse debate it in the fullness of years as great matters deserved. Until then, regrettably, the law was the law, they were findable. This court, he finished, cannot make persons. It has never made a person in 900 years. I asked the bench to instruct the panel accordingly. It was the best argument anyone had made in 12 days, and it was made of exactly one material, and the youngest quill in the spire happened to be the only being in the well who had spent that morning in the one archive where the material was kept. Because Riln had not spent the recess resting, the quill rule had a third function, rarely invoked, never famous. Upon a contested point of record, the certification pool serves the bench with whatever the standing record actually holds. And the standing record of a 900-year-old salvage court holds everything, if a clerk knows how to count. She had gone down into the deep racks with 2 pool mates and the vault's timestamp and an instinct she had been carrying since the 3rd day, since Vorn first said crew and the word had gone through the hall like current. Courts that have never made a person have usually, somewhere, in some dusty matter nobody sang about, done exactly that and called it something smaller. When Guy sat down, Dobin Mar rose from the pool bench and served the bench, on the record, with 3 findings from the deep racks. In the matter of the wreck of the Tesserin Gull, 412 years past, a hold of unregistered tool beasts, claimed as cargo by a charter house, found instead to be a stranded work gang of an unrecognized species. The finding written by this court, the words read aloud now by the marshal, into a hall where no one breathed. They kept their own watch and buried their own dead. The code's cargo columns do not receive them. Status referred upward. Persons in the meantime. The concourse had ratified the referral 2 years later. The species in question now held 4 benches in the concourse itself. In the matter of the derelict Oro's lamp, 290 years past, the same finding, different species, same operative sentence, kept their own watch. In the matter of a nameless ice hauler, 160 years past, the matter 4 lines long, found, not salvage, found, a crew, referred, released. The advocate is correct that this court has never made a person, Mar said, racking the spools with a clerk's precision, claws steady. It has never needed to. Persons make themselves. 3 times in 900 years, this court has been asked to look at beings the code had no column for and say what it found. 3 times it found a watch kept and dead buried, and wrote crew, and referred the great question upward, and released the found in the meantime, because the one thing a salvage court may never do is leave live beings filed as freight while the galaxy debates them. The precedent is not absent, assessors, it is only old. The record remembers what the lanes forgot. And Riln, transcribing her chief clerk at speed, thought, that is what the quill rule is for. Not the refusal. The refusal was only the door. This was the room. 900 years of quiet keeping, 3 small honest findings preserved through every fashion and every house, waiting in the dark of the deep racks for the day a court would need to know what it had once been brave enough to write. Anuvel looked at the carriage-green table for a long moment. The bench declines to instruct the panel as the advocate requests, she said. The panel will be instructed in the words of the Tesserin Gull. The question is not whether the law has a column. The question is what was found. Does the Velith House have further proofs? It did not. It had 1 motion left, and Guy made it with the exhausted elegance of a man playing out a hand he knew was dead. The panel had heard from the patrol, from a confessed slaver, from recordings, but not from the find itself, and any finding would be appealable, unless the record showed the beings in question examined. He expected, Riln understood later, to gain a recess out of it, a day, a chance for the House to reach the concourse's politics overnight, perhaps merely a chance to put a frightened young female on a witness stool and make her grief look like mimicry under an hour of velvet questions. The court calls Sella Marsh, the marshal said. She came around the brass rail and across the well slowly, not from fear. Riln had inventoried that face 14 mornings and knew its weathers by now, slowly because she was reading the room the way she read everything, charting it. And when she passed the small desk in the well, her eyes met the clerk's for the duration of exactly 1 quill stroke. Neither of them changed expression. Both margin columns recorded it. She took the witness ring. She swore the oath in Lane Pigeon without a flaw. And then for the better part of an hour, Maston Guy asked Sella Marsh his velvet questions. And the Hall of Findings learned what the Guilt Promises crew had learned 11 weeks before. That the Blue Wake's junior navigator did not perform, did not plead, did not explain, and could not be made to. He asked about the uprising's violence. She answered, 200 breaths, 1 death. The logs in evidence. He asked whether she expected the panel to believe stock arithmetic justified mutiny against a permitted master. She answered, he wasn't our master. We weren't his stock. The rest is your arithmetic, not mine, he asked silkily. The question under all his questions, what humans even were that this court should rewrite a galaxy for them. And Sella Marsh looked at him with the flat patience of someone who had answered the question already, 26 days running, on every open band, and said, 41 names, you've heard them. We're not asking to be rewritten. We're asking to be read. Guy stood very still for a moment. Then he said no further questions, because there were none. There was nothing in the ring to cross-examine. There was only a person visible from every seat in the hall, and every additional minute she sat there made the Veleth house's whole filing dialect more obscene. It was Anuvel who asked the last question from the bench, and she asked it quietly, granted asking, not procedure why. With the ship taken and the prisoners secured, the humans had spent 26 days steering toward the law that called them cargo, instead of running dark for home and never being found. For the first time in 14 days, Selamarsh hesitated, not lost, consulting the chart. The hall waited. Behind the rail, 33 people waited, children innermost. Because running dark says they were right, she said. Cargo escapes, Assessor. A crew reports. The found panel retired at 7th bell. The wreck jury tradition gave them no time limit and no obligation to explain themselves, and the spire settled in for a night of it. The brokers wiring odds, the dock crews holding their places at the public doors with the patience of people who stood watches for a living, the Veleth factors making quiet calls that were not being returned, because houses can smell a verdict the way ships smell weather, and somewhere in the carriage green hierarchy above Mast and Guy, the decision had already been made to begin describing the whole Guilt Promise venture as the unauthorized excess of a regional office. The panel was out for 51 minutes. Riln was at her desk when they filed back in, because the transcript clerk is always at her desk. It was the pool's whole genius that no moment in 900 years had ever happened without one of them sitting quietly under it, writing. She racked a fresh spool, dated it, and entered the time mark, 8th bell less 9, 12th day, and the 9-lane delegates of the found panel took their alcove without looking at the carriage green table at all, which told the hall the answer before any of them spoke. The tradition was older than the adjudicature itself, older than the spire. Each delegate answered the question put aloud in their own words, one by one, and the finding was the count. The marshal put the question in the words of the Tesserine Gull. What was found aboard the carrier Guilt Promise? The Miners' Combine delegate, first by lot, stood with his docket closed. I've signed for cargo my whole life, he said. Cargo's never once signed back. There's a watch bill in evidence with 40 days of signatures. I find a crew. The delegate of the bonded yards, a crew. The pilot's sodality delegate, the one who had asked the hall who was still working off 44K, stood the longest. I ran the convergence approach for 20 years, he said. I know what a helm sounds like when it's afraid, and I know what one sounds like when it's sure. I listened to that boarding record twice. That helm was sure. Stock doesn't con a dying ship toward the law on purpose. I find a crew, and I find the better one of the two that flew that hull, one by one, down the alcove. A crew, a crew. The 7th delegate, an Orsano-leaning freight factor who had sat carriage green through every session, looked at the ring of gray smocks for a long moment and said, My house insured that voyage. The bond is void if it was persons. I am voting myself a ruinous quarter. He paused. They lettered the slavers' names with the same hand as their own dead. I find a crew. I find persons. Put both my words down. Riln put both his words down. The freight pilot widow from the caress yards was 9th and last, and she stood with her blunt hand flat on her closed docket the way it had lain since the recording cuff played, and she did not give a speech either. The Hall of Findings had somehow, in 12 days, been scoured of everyone willing to give speeches, and was the cleaner for it. My husband's cutter went dark on the open lanes 19 years ago, she said. Locked a natural loss. I've wondered every year since. She looked down at the humans, at Selamarsh, who looked back. Somebody finally came out of that dark and told us what's been moving in it, came loud with names. I find a crew. I find persons. And I find this panel owes them the word it struck on the 5th day. She turned to the bench, an old pilot asking for a heading. They said, We buried our captain. Put it back, Assessor. Stone, not weather. The record will restore it, Anuvel said. And down in the well, the 4th transcript clerk turned 11 days backward through her own certified spool to the strike mark and entered the order and wrote the 4 words back into the standing record of the Pelham lanes with a hand that did not shake at all. We buried our captain. Restored by finding of the panel 12th day. It was the single sweetest quill stroke of her life, and she was aware, even as she made it, that no one in the roaring hall above her was watching it happen, that the loudest day in the spires, history had just been settled as every day was settled by somebody small at a desk writing. 9 for 9, found not salvage, found a crew, found persons. The orders came down from the bench in the far door voice, and Riln took them at speed, and each one landed in the hall like ballast going over the side of something that needed to rise. The claims of the Veleth carriage house, dismissed root and branch. Property claims cannot lie against persons. The house's recovery manifest referred to the concourse as evidence of trade in persons, with the price sheet, the permit ledgers, and the serial stamped snare. The open lane retrieval permits, suspended across the Pelham network pending concourse review, everyone that hour, by wire. The carrier gilt promise, forfeit, title vested in its surviving crew of record. The bench used those words, crew of record, as the instrument of their own deliverance and the only vessel they had. The Pelham rose, fitted with carriage racks sized for a human frame. Impounded at its dock, its master invited to explain his fittings to the patrol. Prize share to the stave of yen on the escort assist schedule, tripled by the bench for service to the integrity of the court. The persons found, released from custody upon rising, free of the lanes, owed the protection of every signatory port, while the great question went upward to the concourse. And the question went upward that night, under the adjudicature's oldest seal, in the form the Tesserin Gull had taught, status referred, persons in the meantime, and one order more, read last in a hall gone quiet enough to hear the quill under it. The matter of the forged verdict, the leak, the chamber that had drafted in a claimant's numbers and tasked itself with eating the proof, referred to the Pelham concourse with the adjudicature's full record and the certification pool's audit attached. And the record of that referral, en nouvelle directed, would state on its face, for the concourse and for the 900 years of clerks to come, that the fraud had been found not by an assessor, not by an advocate, not by a house, but by the fourth transcript clerk of this court in the performance of her ordinary function. Let it stand in the record exactly so. The prime assessor said, grant it to the dome. Courts are not kept honest by their heights. They are kept honest by their floors. This one was. Rilnovit wrote that down too, because it was her function, and if her membranes blurred the well's amber light a little as she wrote, the transcript does not record it. It was while the marshal was reading the release order, upon rising, the humans behind the brass rail coming up out of 12 days of stillness in one motion, the ring opening, Tomas Vega's head appearing over the rail like a swimmer surfacing, that the light in the Hall of Findings changed. The great western windows of the spire looked out on Yen's amber wall, and across that wall, decelerating out of the lane glare with the careful grammar of a helm that wanted no one frightened, came a ship the watch officer's glasses could not at first classify, because it was too small to be an answer and too far from home to be anything else. A single unarmed consular packet, Earth Survey Guild Registry, 400 hours of lane light from its birth, its hull still scarred from the run, every running light burning. It had heard a loop of names 11 weeks ago, relayed lane to lane, and it had been coming ever since. It did not hail the court. It did not enter the dispute. It took up station outside the western windows in plain sight of every broker, delegate, assessor, and house factor on Tessel Spire, and it held there, silent, lit, patient as arithmetic, and the lanes which had spent 12 days asking what humans were, looked out the window at the answer nobody had needed a panel for. When you take 41 of them, the rest set out, however far, however few. They come for their own, and they arrive quietly, and they wait where you can see them. Escorts here, Selamarsh said, to no one in particular, in the tone of a navigator logging a fix she had plotted long ago. What followed the verdict, the wire services called the Tessel audit, and it ran for a season, and Rilnovit had a desk-level view of every hour of it, because audits are made of clerks. The Velith carriage house did not fall in a day. Houses never do. It fell the way a badly stowed cargo falls, one lashing at a time, each failure loading the next. The suspended permits came first, 41 retrieval licenses across the Pelham network, everyone drawing dock fees on ships that could no longer legally find anything, everyone a house asset now worth less than its mooring. Then the Orsano Mutual Bench, which had lost its case and been saved by losing it, a bond on cargo was ruinous, but a bond procured by fraud on persons was void from the beginning, with every premium recoverable, turned on its former co-claimant with the whole-hearted savagery of an indemnity house presented with a survivable exit, and Orsano's auditors knew where the Velith bodies were stowed, because Orsano had been underwriting the stowage for years. The price sheet went up the wire to the concourse with the referral, per unit, by age band, in the house's own ledger hand, and after that no delegation in the lanes would be seen sharing a dock with Carriage Green. The house survived technically the way a hull survives on the bottom of a harbor, present, charted, and a hazard to navigation only if you anchored on it. Maston Gee submitted a bill for his services and, when it went unpaid by a regional office that no longer officially existed, sued his own former client with the same beautiful baritone and won. Riln transcribed that hearing to and entered into her margin column, not without a certain professional respect, that the man argued the Velith house into ruin twice, once in each direction, and was word perfect both times. Karstavain never returned to the spire. The concourse's commissioners came down the lanes within the month, and the certification pool's audit went to them sealed and when in whole, the Requisition logs, the print drum records that put the leaked sheet's master in Amit Sorrell's soft hands 11 hours before the brokers had it, the wire route from a Chambers terminal to a Velith Factor's box, and the draft verdict itself recovered from the sealed chambers, citing 44K in the second assessor's own dictation glyphs, dated the detail the wire services loved. The detail Riln had known was coming since the recess huddle. The dated draft was 3 days older than the close of testimony. He had written the ending before the witnesses finished, like a bad clerk copying tomorrow's weather from yesterday's. The lanes did not shackle assessors. The concourse struck his name from the rolls in an open session, relayed to every signatory port, which, for a man who had spent 22 years being believed, was the harder sentence, and everyone who had ever stood in the gentle weather of his chambers knew it. Dury Holland swore his whole testimony again before the concourse commissioners, 4 voyages of it, names and routes and serials, and his evidence broke open 2 more retrieval crews working 2 other survey margins before the season turned. The adjudicature, which still held criminal referral over him, weighed 11 voyages of columns against 1 shot fired through his brother's shoulder and a season of telling the truth at ruinous length, and rendered the only verdict in the whole affair that nobody wired odds on. Guilt entered. Sentence suspended into service, 10 years as a flagged witness and lane monitor on the routes he had once hunted, his cuff recording always. His testimony permanently on call. He asked one condition, and the bench, after a silence, allowed it, that his brother's body go home to the Holland family moon for burial. Carried, this was the condition, aboard the Guilt Promise, by the crew that had lettered his name. Marsh said yes before the bench could finish asking. When the wire services asked her why, she gave them 4 words in the door. We keep our logs. The audit's longest shadow fell where nobody had thought to look, backward. The phrase natural loss had been a column heading in the lane registries for 300 years, the quiet drawer where the open dark filed its bills. And the matter of the Guilt Promise had shown every registrar in the network exactly what drawer could hold. Within the season, the Pelham Concourse ordered the column reopened. Every unexplained loss on the survey margins for 50 years, re-examined against the routes in Dury Holland's testimony and the serials in the patrol's evidence. And the clerks of 19 ports went down into their own deep racks the way Riln had gone down into hers. They came back up with patterns, lure beacons logged as debris, transponders that had stopped mid-word. Hulls found hold in the ballast, always reading afterward like accident. 31 losses were reclassified that year from natural to taken, with referrals attached, and each reclassification was a family somewhere on some margin learning, decades late, that they had not been careless or cursed, or simply unlucky that someone had aimed. One of the 19 ports was a Chorus Yards way station, and one of the 31 files carried the registry of a patrol cutter that had gone dark 19 years before. The freight pilot widow was sitting as a found panel delegate on an ordinary lien matter the day the notice reached her, and the adjudicature's record, Riln kept it so Riln knew, shows the session recessed for a quarter bell at the bench's own motion. No reason entered. The reason stood in the gallery doorway holding a wire sheet reading the one line that mattered. Not lost. Taken. Route consistent. Evidence referred. The widow had voted 9th and last and said somebody finally came out of that dark and told us what's been moving in it. And the dark had answered her by name. Marsh heard of it 4 relays out on the long run home and sent back a single unsigned line that the waste station's operators copied and kept, because the lanes were already learning what humans did with words. He kept his watch. It was the weather that lied. Vaughan's patrol wing spent 2 years pulling snares out of the survey margins like bad teeth. They found 11. Everyone carried Velith serials. Everyone went into evidence whole. The humans stayed 19 days past the verdict, and Tessel Spire, which had watched them for 12 days through a brass rail, got to watch what they did with freedom, which was, in order, hold a memorial, fix a ship, and pay their debts. The memorial was held in the bond warehouse where they had been inventoried every morning, all 34 of them in 7 sheeted absences, and they invited their witnesses. Vaughan and her boarding party, the freight pilot widow, the night bailiff who had kept his lamp low, a certain transcript clerk, and Riln stood in the back and heard 41 names read one to a breath, by a boy whose voice had finished, changing somewhere in the season's middle, and discovered that her people's driest training was no protection whatsoever in a room built for echoes. The ship they fixed was the Guilt Promise, because it was theirs, the bench had vested it, the instrument of their own deliverance, and the dock crews of the Spire, who had stood 3 deep at the public doors for the verdict, came down to the forfeit slaver in their off-shifts with tools and spare stock and no invoices, and Priya Anand ran them all like a chief of the yard, one eye still half shut, profanity multilingual, and the third coil got rebuilt properly at last. They cut the carriage racks out of hold 2 first thing, every bolt of them, and the dock crews expected the alloy to go to the breakers. Instead, the humans machined it down and recast it on a borrowed forge into 41 small flat plates name-stamped and set them into the hold's bare deck in a ring, children's names innermost. The hold was not refitted for anything after that. It shipped empty, a hold-size log entry, stone where the weather had been. And the debts. They paid the Spire's chandlers in survey data, the richest cargo the Blue Wakes family had ever carried. 20 years of charted margins no house map showed. They paid Vorn's cutter crew in a dinner cooked by 34 pairs of hands in the patrol mess, at which the stave of Yen's log notes with patrol dryness, the find requested seconds. And on the last morning, 19th day after verdict, the acting master of the renamed ship, for they had renamed her at the stern in fair lettering, Blue Wake's answer, came down the certification vault's corridor with a parcel under her arm, asking, in correct court dialect, for the 4th transcript clerk. They met in the smallest transcript room, the one with no window and one door, because Riln was working, and Sella Marsh was not a person who interrupted a watch. The human sat on the copy table's edge and waited, reading the room the way she read everything, and Riln finished her page. Sella would have thought less of her for not finishing it, and racked her quill, and for a moment the two of them regarded each other across 2 species, 1 verdict, and 14 mornings of a lamp held low. We ship at 6th bell, Sella said. Patrol escort to the convergence, then the consul packet takes the lead. 400 hours home, she paused. Closer to 480. Priya wants the 3rd coil run gentle, and Priya gets what Priya wants now. It's in the articles. You wrote articles. First thing, after the renaming, a crew has articles. She said it without irony, a navigator stating a fix, and then she put the parcel on the copy table between them. We had a dispute over this. The whole crew, 2 watches of arguing. I won, because I'm master and the articles say so. Open it after we clear the dome. Then, because humans could not help themselves and Riln had filled half a margin column with the ways they could not, it's nothing. It's everything we had. Riln did not say it is improper for a clerk to accept gifts from parties, because the matter was closed, the parties were persons, and her own training had been losing arguments in this room for 19 days. She put her quill hand flat on the parcel, which among Sarwin meant received and witnessed and kept. I have something as well, she said, and slid the flat archive case across the table. She had made it herself on her own shifts, with the vault's blessing and the timestamp seal, a certified duplicate, complete, of the standing record in the matter of the carrier guilt promise. Every filing, every transcript, every exhibit, the strike and the restoration, the 9 findings spoken one by one, the orders, the referral, all of it, closed under the adjudicature's ribbon with her own certification at the foot of the last page. The first complete certified record ever issued to a human crew. In the first matter in which humans had ever been parties instead of property. 480 hours is a long watch, Riln said. Your people memorize things, I've seen it. 8 words at a time. She pushed the case the last finger width across the table. Memorize this, all of it. Your grammar is good enough now, and your children's will be better. The next crew of yours that comes up against a house in some hall where nobody knows them, and there will be a next one. The lanes are long and the code is old. They shouldn't have to win it the way you did, by being extraordinary in front of the right 9 strangers. They should be able to stand up, cite the matter of the guilt promise, and watch the dockets open. She heard her own voice go, for one stroke, right out of the register of paper. Make them check, Sella Marsh, forever. That's the whole trick of civilization. It's just people who can be made to check. The human looked at the case for a while. When she looked up, the weather in her face was one Riln's column had no precedent for, and so the column simply recorded it new. You know what the loop should have said? Sela's voice was level, because she made it level. We are the crew of the survey tender Blue Wake, and somewhere out there is one clerk who reads the footnotes. That's what we were betting on the whole 26 days, and we didn't even know your name. She stood and put out her hand, human fashion, and Riln took it, Sarwin fashion, quill hand, ink stains and all. The articles of the Blue Wake's answer carry a standing entry now. Page 1, under the names of the dead. It says, this crew sails because a 4th transcript clerk of the adjudicature of wrecks and findings counted to 19. Her grip tightened, 1 stroke's worth. We keep our logs. Come and read yours someday. You have a berth wherever we're flying, as long as the hull holds, and knowing Priya, that's longer than your court. She was at the door before Riln found anything at all to put in the silence, and what she found was small and exact, and the only thing she had. The boy, she said. Thomas. When he reads the names now, does he still start with your captain? Sella stopped in the doorway. Always. Good, Riln said. First entries hold the page. Every clerk knows it. Tell him, and the driest training in the spire surrendered without conditions. Tell him he wrote the best document I ever certified. At 6 bell, the Blue Wake's answer cleared Tessel's spire with every running light burning, which was not regulation, and the harbor master logged it as a lighting fault, which was not true, and half the dock shift stood out on the cold gantries to watch her go, which was not explainable to anyone who had spent the season somewhere else. She ran her loop one last time on the open band as she cleared the dome, the names all 41, one to a breath, and then, at the edge of the beacon chain, a new closing line in a young woman's voice, replacing the old one forever, logged by every receiver on the spire and relayed, in the weeks after, lane by lane, much further than anyone planned. We are the crew of the Blue Wake's answer. We were red, so will you be. Keep coming to the light. The console packet fell in ahead of her. The patrol cutter took up the flank, and the 3 of them went up the lane into the amber and were gone. And Tessel's spire went back to work, because ports do not grieve and dockets do not pause. There was a wrecked grain barge on the next day's list, and 2 leans against a tug, and the long gray ordinary river of the law resumed its flow as though the season had never happened, except that it had, and the river knew. Riln opened the parcel that night, alone in the clerk's alcove, at the small desk in the well of the empty hall of findings, under the dome where Yen's amber light came down like old honey. Inside was a plate of recast alloy, machined flat, name stamped. The 42nd plate, the one the crew had argued over for 2 watches, cut from the same rack metal as the ring in the silent hold. It carried 3 lines in fair lettering, the same hand that had lettered names on the chests of enemies and family alike. The first line said R. Ovit, 4th transcript clerk. The second said crew. The third line was the 8 words, her 8 words. The ones she had read into a packed hall at transcription pace, the pace that lets a thing be written onto the bodies of everyone hearing it. We found them on the bridge, flying her. She sat with it a long time. Then she went down to the certification vault, signed the night log, and entered the parcel into her line's permanent archive. The rack where Sarwin kept the proofs of their seals across generations. The documents their descendants would be sworn on. Her line had been seated at the court for 200 years on good behavior. Let the next 200 be sworn on this. The great question went up the lanes, and the lanes answered it the way Riln had told the bench rivers answer anything, slowly, then all at once. The concourse debated for 2 years, which for the concourse was a dead sprint, while the matter of the guilt promise sat in the middle of the docket like a stone in a current, cited, copied, taught, and human crews did exactly what a clerk in a windowless room had told them to, stood up in salvage halls and customs courts and bond hearings from one end of the network to the other, and made them check. By the time the ratification vote came, it was not a question being decided but a fact being filed, and the wire services noted, without fully understanding what they were noting, that the instrument's operative clause did not use the concourse's lofty drafting dialect at all. It used the words of a 900-year-old salvage finding, the words of the Tesserine Gull, the words 9 lane delegates had said one by one into an amber hall. They kept their own watch and buried their own dead. Personhood in the lanes would rest forever on that, not on power, not on fleets, not on the size of anyone's fear, but on a watch bill and a cold locker and the way a species lettered its enemies' names with the same care as its own. Dobin Mar retired at the turn of that year, 41 years on his seal, and the pool gathered in the vault to see his quill racked for the last time, and the old Hamat made the only speech of his life, which was 11 words long. Serve the record rightly kept will serve everyone else. The prime assessor came down personally to name his successor, which had never once happened in the spire's memory, and Granite read the appointment into the standing record in the far door voice while the youngest chief clerk in the history of the adjudicature of wrecks and findings stood in the lamplight with her quill hand steady and her membranes failing her completely, and nobody in the vault pretended otherwise, and it went in the margin of every clerk present, in the column the record refuses, where the true history of every court is kept. She certified verdicts for 60 more years. She trained 41 clerks, a number she never once admitted choosing. And every year on the anniversary of the 12th day, a wire came down the lanes from somewhere out along the survey margins. Different ports, different relays, the same registry, Blue Wake's answer, and in later decades her daughter hulls, Reyes's answer and Anand's answer, and one irreverent little fast packet called the footnote. And the wire always carried the same message, never signed, never needing to be. The full count of the crew, every name, the living and the dead together, one to a breath. And under the names, every year the same 4 words, the first entry of the articles, the heading of the whole long log that came after, the words a young woman had, stood up and said behind a brass rail when she had nothing else in the galaxy to put on the record, and which the record in the end had kept. We buried our captain. Rilnovet read them at her desk each year in the well of the bright amber hall, with the day's docket waiting and the long gray river of the law moving past her lamp. Then she filed the wire where her oaths could reach it, took up her quill, and went back to work, because that was the whole of her function, and most of her religion, and because somewhere out in the dark between lanes, there was always another ship coming toward the light, counting on somebody small to be sitting at the bottom of the law reading every line. The clerk certifies.